There's no question that we live in an era of climate change. The conclusion from the IPCC is that climate change, warming in the climate system, is unequivocal, no doubt. It's also clear that these climate changes have expressed themselves in a wide range of features of the physical environment. We've seen it in changes in temperature, changes in the ocean, changes in the extent of ice, changes in precipitation. Human influence on the climate system is clear. We're really beyond the stage when there's an important discussion about whether or not climate change is occurring and whether or not humans are causing it. Now, the appropriate focus should be on what are the impacts, what are the prospects for modulating those impacts with adaptation and mitigation, and how can we make the smartest set of decisions that, in the words of Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, find a way to address the climate challenge at the same time we're addressing the challenge of economic development. When we look at impacts of climate change, there's no question that impacts have already occurred. But in order to understand the impacts, it's important to step back and ask, what's the essential nature of climate change? And I want to build the argument here that climate change is essentially a challenge in managing risks. We understand a great deal about the physics and the drivers of climate change. We understand a great deal about the consequences, but that doesn't mean that today or in a decade or in 3 decades, the scientific community will be projecting a specific impact at specific places. And as I describe why it's a challenge in managing risk, that should become clear. There are several advantages of thinking about climate change as a challenge in managing risk, and let me mention these right at the outset. One is that we live in a world where we're not prepared for the climate variability we already face. That's been illustrated with tragic consequences in Bulgaria in recent months, where there have been massive economic losses and tragic loss of life from severe flooding that had at least partly a climate trigger. So we know we're not prepared with the climate conditions we face. This is true around the world. It's as true in rich societies and as it is in poor societies. And it's clear that we would benefit from increased investment in preparing for the climate that we already live in, a climate that has some components of change and it has some components of persistent variability. The second motivation for understanding climate as a challenge in managing risk is we increasingly know that the impacts from the climate system typically occur in extremes, whether we're talking about climate variability or climate change. When things break is when temperatures are unusually high, when precipitation rates are unusually high, when there's an extended period without precipitation, or when severe storms strike. It's in the extremes that things break. The way to think about it is that climate extremes are sort of the sharp end of the climate stick. And in the climate science community, we've invested many years in understanding most likely outcomes, but we're only beginning to have a clear understanding of the influence of climate change on extremes. Really important agenda where we're learning more and more, but we also understand the limitations of our knowledge. A third motivation for understanding climate change as a challenge in managing risk is that we really don't understand the details of where the climate will be at a given point in the future. As I said, we've invested a lot of time in understanding the most likely outcomes of human impacts on climate. But when we think about risk, how we provide protection, risk is usually some kind of combination of the probability of an event and its consequences. And when we understand risk in that framing, it's really critical that we have a feel for both the most likely outcomes, but also the lower probability outcomes that potentially have the highest consequences. We need to look at the full range of possible outcomes and incorporate those into our overall strategy of responses. A fourth motivation for understanding climate as a challenge in managing risks is that across society, from the level of families to the level of states, we have a wide range of sophisticated tools for managing risk. At the level of the family, those decisions go into things like purchasing an automobile that has airbags for crash protection. At the level of a firm, it goes into things like deciding what kinds of investments to make so that financial risk is minimized. And at the level of a state, it goes into things like understanding how long infrastructure should be designed to last, what kind of protection there should be in the national security domain, and what kind of protection there should be in the environmental security domain. A wide range of tools. They're not always very effectively deployed, but a wide range of tools are available that we can capitalize on.
The hazard part of the equation doesn't lead to impacts unless it's accompanied by two other things. One is vulnerability. Vulnerability is lack of preparedness or sensitivity to harm. We know around the world that vulnerability is high and that we're not prepared for dealing with the climate conditions we already face. And we know that in many cases, investments in decreasing vulnerability can yield a wide range of societal benefits. The third ingredient that's necessary for a climate risk to materialize into a climate impact is exposure. Exposure is a measure of the assets at risk. Are there people, are there homes, are there factories, are there highways that are in harm's way? And without the combination of these three, the climate hazard, the vulnerability, and the exposure, there's no risk from a changing climate. What are the implications of this? The implications are that the physics of climate change are driving primarily the hazard component, and if we want to deal with that, the main way to deal with it is through decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs, through mitigation. Vulnerability and exposure are sensitive to a wide range of processes within the human environment. Economic development can either contribute to decreasing vulnerability or increasing vulnerability as a consequence of what kinds of policies are deployed at the scale of governments. Economic development can contribute to increasing exposure if assets are put in bad locations, or it can contribute to decreasing exposure if planning takes account of climate change and focuses on the kinds of locations that are most compatible with providing protection. The really compelling feature of thinking about risk of climate impacts from this overlap of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure is that there are multiple pathways to producing solutions. It's not just a question of mitigating, it's not just a question of adapting. We have a wide range of solutions, and that's where I want to come back at the end of my remarks tonight. There's no question that climate change impacts have already occurred. The way we characterize them in the most recent IPCC report, which was released in March of this year, is that impacts of climate changes that have already occurred are widespread and they're consequential. We've seen impacts on every continent that we can attribute to climate change, and in the oceans. We've seen impacts from the equators to the poles and the coast to the mountains. We've seen impacts in three different kinds of domains. Impacts in the physical environment, especially in the lengths of glaciers, the timing and flow of rivers, and in the level of the ocean. We've seen impacts in the biological domain. Widespread changes in the occurrence of wildfire and forest ecosystems, some impacts on species extinctions, and lots of examples of impacts of climate change on species ranges and the timing of activity. We also have seen an increasing number of impacts on the human system. Some of these impacts have been on food production, some of these impacts have been on economic activities, especially related to transportation and manufacturing. Let me give one example of the kind of impact now that we can attribute to climate change, and this one involves food security. Most of you probably know that increasing crop yields has been one of the real triumphs of human enterprise over the last half century or so. Year in and year out, yields of the world's major food crops have increased by 1 or 2% per year. But we're now seeing that climate change is making it more and more difficult to increase yields of the major food crops. In particular, this is true for wheat and maize. With wheat, the clear indication is that climate changes that have occurred over the last several decades have subtracted about 2% per decade from the yield increases we would otherwise have seen. With maize, that number is about 1% per decade. The way to understand that is like climate change is an anchor, making it more and more difficult for us to realize the needs of food security around the world. There are dozens of examples like this where we can clearly attribute an impact that's already occurred to climate, even though we live in a world where lots of things are happening simultaneously, and the world's agriculturalists are continuing to make productive and useful investments in increasing crop yields. It's just that climate change is making it harder and harder.
A new insight that's really just come into focus in the last few years is that adaptation, mitigation, and economic development really can be different sides of the same coin. Over the next 25 years, the world will probably spend between $70 and $100 trillion on energy. You can think about that as a huge price to pay in order to meet the challenges of tomorrow, and it certainly is. But I think that an amazing feature of that number is it represents an economic opportunity. For me, at least, the big economic opportunity of the 21st century is building the energy system, and that expectation of huge expenditures for energy is really fundamentally empowering for a wide new set of technologies. What technologies are they going to be? Well, that's not for me to predict, but the kinds of opportunities that are out there are especially bright in the area of energy efficiency, which typically yields a win-win, saving consumers money at the same time it decreases energy demand. Renewable technologies where the price has progressively gotten lower and lower and lower, so that at some point in the not too distant future, renewables are likely to be cheaper than fossil. Whether or not we decide to deploy nuclear is going to be an important discussion that I hope is occurring in every society around the world. And the challenge there, of course, is if nuclear can be made safe enough to be acceptable. And it obviously shouldn't be deployed unless it is safe. And then finally, whether there's a space for a continuing role for fossil-based energy with the CO2 captured and permanently stored. At least for me, when I step back and look at the opportunity for building a robust energy system, look at that in the context of the opportunities for adaptation, and recognize that many of the steps for adaptation, mitigation, really are the same things that contribute to not only economic development, but sustainable development. I read this dialogue with a lot of optimism. It's clear that we face climate challenges, but we have a window of opportunity to act. If we can be effective turning the corner on emissions in the next few decades, we really have the potential not only to hold climate change to the level where we can adapt to it, but to use those investments to build robust economies and vibrant societies. That's the thought I want to leave you all with, and I hope you join me in the challenge of dealing with a changing climate. Thanks very much.